Welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, the show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. If you're looking for a podcast to keep you informed and ahead of the game in business, the GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Business News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Paula DuPont, and today we have a number of topics, many of which are relative to the fallout that's come from the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis, and what some business reactions to that are. And one of the first stories that we're going to talk about is the re-examination of some brands and the imagery that's used and some of the ideology that's behind it that's in question. And we're talking about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, Mrs. Butterworth. So we'll talk more about that in just a moment. We're going to talk about how Netflix CEO and his wife are donating a large sum of money to the United Negro College Fund and some other historically black colleges. We're going to talk about Google and its efforts to look at getting more black executives on its board, and also other things that it's doing to increase diversity within its workforce. We're then going to talk about Hilton hotel chain line and how that's been impacted by the coronavirus, and as well as looking more broadly at hotels in New York City and what's going on there as a result of the pandemic. Then we're going to explore the PPP loans and who kind of got left out from that and the impact that that's having. And finally, we're going to talk about some big news with Spotify. So stay tuned. We've got a lot of great topics to discuss, and we're going to get started in just a moment. Most everyone knows there's been a big outcry and reaction ever since the George Floyd killing at the end of May. And we know, obviously, about the protests and those who've taken advantage of the protests and rioted and looted. We have since learned, we're learning every day, about companies that are showing their support for Black Lives Matter and their commitment to increasing diversity and ending racism in whatever way it works within their companies. And so we're seeing a lot of commitment coming from companies right now. Why just now? I don't know. It almost seems like, people are hopping on board for fear of not doing something. I'm hoping that it's all sincere, what companies are doing. But nonetheless, they are stepping up and finally doing some things that probably should have been done a long time ago. Case in point, the Aunt Jemima brand. And currently, Pepsi Company owns Aunt Jemima brand, obviously along with a lot of other products. And recently, they said that they would retire the brand because of its origin in racist imagery of Black people. Along those same lines, the Mars Company, which owns Uncle Ben's brand, that's the rice, and also ConAgra brand, which owns Mrs. Butterworth, they are also reviewing their brands. Those latter two, not necessarily retiring them, or at least that hasn't been decided yet, but they are looking at those brands and figuring out what they're going to do about it. Reviewing these decades-old brands is just part of the recent movement that we're seeing among other companies who are re-examining some of their products or their services. You see the owners of Gone with the Wind now contemplating how widely available that is and if context should be given to it if it does run again. I believe it was pulled from HBO, at least temporarily. You see Netflix running or prominently promoting some shows that help support the Black Lives Matter movement, in that there's shows about racial injustice and documentaries and some other material, and putting that up in the forefront. And then you see also, cop shows. Cops was pulled, and everything's being looked at as it probably should be. And I think there's obviously a new awareness that is making us all take a look at things that we've just grown to accept, and we're part of the culture here. So, and companies are looking at the Juneteenth celebration that is on June 19th, and where there was not as much attention paid to it in the past. It currently is getting more attention, and some companies have made it a holiday for their employees, or have given some time off in recognition of the holiday. But for Pepsi Company, that owns the Aunt Jemima brand, they have this isn't a matter of just pulling the product. They have to totally redesign the brand and offer to do that. As far as the reports I've seen, it's not that they're caving to pressure or that someone's called for it, but that it's their own introspection leading them to do that. And that they are saying that there will be a new name for Aunt Jemima, and the packaging would change as well, and that we probably can expect to see that in the fourth quarter this year. Mars Company, that owns the Uncle Ben's brand, said that it was going to change its name and the packaging, and they did not give a projection of when that might be and what the new name might be. As I mentioned before, ConAgra is looking or reviewing its Mrs. Butterworth brand and the packaging. Right now, Mrs. Butterworth is, the maple syrup at least, is sold in a clear bottle in the shape of a woman. And the company had said that the idea was the woman was to portray or represent a loving grandmother kind of figure. Still, nonetheless, they are re-examining that and maybe changing the name and packaging of that as well. Along similar lines, earlier this year, dairy company Land O'Lakes dropped the indigenous woman Mia. It had long featured on its packaging. The company said the change was meant to better reflect its culture. So again, that was done earlier, prior to the George Floyd killing. So all of these efforts are part of, as I said, I think a larger examination that companies are making, looking at themselves and at their products and their cultures to see if they are reflecting their employees' values. And there's, definitely an increased pressure for them to do so. Because people are being vocal and are demanding it from their employers. So more coming on that, and in fact, upcoming segments of this podcast, like the next one, Netflix talks about what another company, or at least an individual representing that company, is doing to honor Black Lives Matter and to help further the cause. So more on that after this commercial message.
Are you looking for a podcast that gives you all of the latest news from the world of finance? Then check out the GSMC Financial News Podcast. We'll delve into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the world of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we'll cover it on the GSMC Financial News Podcast.
I mentioned earlier that Netflix is one of the companies that is trying to be more responsive about its sensitivities to more racially equal programming, and they have been promoting lots of predominantly black cast movies and TV programs and documentaries, and those that tell the story that's very relevant right now. But in addition to that, and separate from that, the Netflix Inc. CEO, Reed Hastings, and his wife, Patty Quillen, are donating $120 million to historically black colleges and universities. The funds will be split between Morehouse and Spelman colleges and the United Negro College Fund. The funds combined make for the largest gift ever to historically black colleges, and they'll be used for scholarships and also to help the schools rebound from the pandemic and the impact of that financially. The Morehouse president, David A. Thomas, said, "This is a watershed moment. It will send a signal that historically black colleges should be valued in the same way that we value our most successful undergraduate colleges in this country." Typically, historically black colleges have less cash saved, and they receive much less philanthropic backing than predominantly white institutions. I found that very interesting, and it was different than what I had expected. And apparently there are no historically black college and universities among the nation's 100 largest endowments, and that's according to the National Association of College and University Business Officers. The gift is expected to be an acknowledgement by many white communities that they have benefited from certain privileges and left others at a disadvantage. This is according to Hastings, the CEO. He has said in an interview that the 9-figure donation had a long gestational period, as he has been donating to the UNCF for years after working with its president and CEO, Michael Lomax, on the board of KIPP charter schools. He decided to donate the money now because of this crisis in America. And he noted that the pandemic's effects on the black community and recent killings of black citizens by police were the primary reasons for it. Census data shows that about 26% of black people aged 25 or older have at least a bachelor's degree, compared with 36% of the total U.S. population and 40% of white people. This, by the way, is according to a Wall Street Journal article. Black students make up about 13% of the current undergraduate population and are disproportionately high share of the enrollment at for-profit colleges. Spelman College has said that it will use the donation to cover tuition and other expenses for 20 first-year students, renewable each year for the duration of their studies, with new cohorts being added for at least 10 years. The idea is that when these students would go to graduate, they will be debt-free, these 20 students per year. Dr. Thomas said he had desperately wanted to attend Morehouse as a student, but didn't get a full ride there and so couldn't afford it. And he went to Yale instead because they gave him more financial aid. The United Negro College Fund said that it was going to use its allotment of that money for scholarships, as well as to help the 37 member colleges that are part of the UNCF to help them reopen, and also to find firmer financial footing for them since they've had to shift online for teaching because of the pandemic. So it seems like a real practical way to help colleges and universities overall who are struggling with transitioning back to the way they operated before, with many just recognizing that they won't be able to go back to the way they were before. But enrollments have been down, and applications for fall enrollments are down. And so, colleges and universities are really struggling. But in this case, for those historically black colleges and universities who have, as indicated before, don't get as much aid as other colleges, this will be a helpful boost for them in hopefully getting back on track for next fall. So we are going to take another commercial break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Google's recent efforts in looking at diversity within its organization.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
According to an article in the Wall Street Journal, Google is setting goals for more diversity. Google announced a new hiring goal to dramatically boost the number of black executives for the company. The initiative was laid out in a memo to staff on Wednesday, June 17th, by Chief Executive Sundar Pichai. He places the company firmly to one side on cultural issues that have historically roiled its staff. The company has been the subject of lawsuits and internal debates over whether efforts to increase diversity discriminated against white and Asian men. Pichai, who was born in India, said he had aimed to increase the proportion of quote-unquote leadership representation of underrepresented groups. And he wanted to do this overall by 30% at the company by 2025. He said that the Alphabet Inc. unit would provide $175 million in a mix of financing and funding to related businesses. Google's leadership is 2.6% Black and 3.7% Latinx, according to the company's 2020 diversity report, which defined those categories. Nearly 2/3 of the leadership is white. The report also said, though, that new hires were proportionally more diverse. So I guess they have been making some headway in terms of their diverse hiring practices. The new hiring goal is among several measures Google plans to take, from building more inclusive practices to anti-racism educational programs. Google also said it would stop letting employees target so-called tailgaters or unauthorized visitors at offices. That practice of employees checking badges was vulnerable to bias, Mr. Pache said, Rather, that task would be left to professional security staff. Google obviously is not the only one that's been struggling with diversity issues in its ranks. Facebook has also been struggling and recently has expanded the role of its chief diversity officer, elevating her to report directly to COO Sheryl Sandberg. Pepsi Company also this week had announced an initiative similar to Google's that aimed to expand the beverage company's Black managerial ranks by 30% by 2025. PepsiCo said its U.S. workforce was 14% Black overall. And it doesn't break down, or at least according to what I read, it doesn't break down, management versus professional versus other jobs. Last week, Adidas said it is increasing the number of Black employees and investing $20 million in Black communities after some U.S. employees complained the company was profiting from the Black culture without doing enough to help them. Now, it's interesting that some of these companies are making these announcements at this time when diversity efforts have been going on for decades with some companies, and some companies being very transparent and, promoting what they're doing and having diversity officers or diversity chiefs. And yet it doesn't always work. In fact, another story that came out on the 18th was that ex-Morgan Stanley diversity chief sues for alleged race discrimination. So this Marilyn Booker, who was terminated from the firm in 2019, she says that her efforts at improving diversity at Morgan Stanley went unsupported by company leaders and were at times undermined, according to her lawsuit that was filed this week. She points to severe underrepresentation of minorities among Morgan Stanley's management and advisors. She was the global head of diversity at Morgan Stanley. And as I said, she's suing them for race discrimination. And she went on to say that clearly there has been absolutely no progress with respect to Morgan Stanley's diversity efforts under CEO James Gorman's leadership, her lawsuit said. Morgan Stanley disputes the allegations. The discrimination lawsuit is the most recent of several filed against major financial service companies, and that raising the question about how much progress the industry has actually made in terms of diversity and inclusion. Despite years of effort and pledges from wealth management leaders to enact changes in the industry, the financial advice business remains a largely white profession. 82% of advisors were white in 2019, compared to 6.9% Black and 6.3% Hispanic. And that's according to data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Blacks and Hispanics comprise 13.4% and 18.3% of the U.S. population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So, this is a lawsuit, so, neither side, or particularly Morgan Stanley, probably can't say much more about it while it's in litigation. But, clearly from the standpoint that she's in, as having been the diversity officer, she has a pretty compelling argument, at least. I'm not taking sides. Will be settled in the court, but it's interesting that would come out at this time, though she was terminated a while ago. So apparently, there was something that she needed to bring to the forefront during this time when we're examining, companies are examining their diversity efforts. So I believe at this point, we are ready to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Hilton and the impact of the coronavirus on them. You remember the coronavirus, right? That was the other big news topic that we've been talking about for months, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hilton Worldwide Holdings, Inc. said it is cutting nearly 22% of its workforce globally, largely because of the effects of the pandemic. According to an article that I read, job reductions will amount to about 2,100 corporate employees, according to Hilton. The hospitality company said it is also extending its corporate pay cuts, reduced hours, and furloughs for up to 3 more months. And it is considered to be something unprecedented in Hilton's 101-year-old history. So I guess they must have been around during the Spanish flu, if that's the case. Although probably not anywhere near looking like what it does today. But still, it's a long history, and, there's that word again, unprecedented. They're looking at it as it's a global crisis, and that it has brought the travel industry to a virtual standstill. And so naturally, it's going to have its impact on one of the biggest hotel companies in the world. Hilton's move is the latest sign that the hospitality industry continues to face headwinds from the COVID-19 pandemic, which did cause, as I said, the travel industry to collapse, and occupancy levels fell below 30% earlier this spring in the U.S. Hilton shares rose 1% in Tuesday this week, trading on the New York Stock Exchange. The company has picked up a bit in recent weeks, led by leisure travelers taking short trips. Corporate and group travel remain subdued. Analysts don't expect overall hotel revenue to return to 2019 levels until at least 2022, or even later, they're saying. It's funny. I think there's been some mixed messages about the prospects of the travel industry. It seems other reports recently have said it may come back sooner than originally anticipated. But, in this case, looking at Hilton, it's looking a little more bleak, saying 2022 or even later. In May, Hyatt Hotels Corporation had said it would implement layoffs and restructure roles, which would affect about 1,300 employees globally. A Hyatt spokeswoman declined to say what percentage of the global staff would be affected, but said about 350 employees at Hyatt's Chicago headquarters would be affected. Marriott International, Inc. Had said that it is extending a furlough program through October 2nd, and that it was offering buyouts to corporate employees who may choose to leave the company to pursue other opportunities. And we know that phrase, don't we? Marriott declined to say how many employees it expects to cut through this offer or any future retrenchment, but some industry executives expect it to be in line with the percentage of staff cuts Hilton is making. Hilton said the corporate staff it is cutting will get severance pay and access to an expedited recruitment process when travel resumes, as well as other benefits. Initial jobless claims in the U.S. spiked at the end of March, but have fallen since then. The hospitality industry, as people avoided traveling, has been one of the sectors hugely affected by the pandemic. So, not so great for Hilton and some of the other major hotel companies. And in what I read, it doesn't talk about at all, the impact that some of them have faced from Airbnb and other types of lodging that's come up in recent years. Although it's probably a different target market that they have than the Airbnb. So maybe that's why it's not mentioned in this context. But let's face it. I mean, we know that, COVID has had quite an impact. And in fact, another article that I'd seen talked about New York City and how it's being affected overall because of tourism and the lack of it. And, most things have been closed. They're just now, I think, getting ready to open up some venues, some things. I don't know about some of the popular attractions yet. I think they're still pretty much on lockdown. But in this recent report, it said that New York is facing 20% loss of hotel rooms. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Kind of falls in line with what I was just saying about Hilton and the others. The report said that New York hotels went into the coronavirus suffering already with a problem with falling occupancy and room rates because of a glut of new development. And then now travel restrictions and a tattered economy brought about by COVID-19 have aggravated an already bad situation. As many as 25,000 rooms, or 20% of New York's total, might not reopen, according to some analysts. and that is the equivalent to the entire size of hotel markets in Louisville, Kentucky, or Jacksonville, Florida. The dire mood has lifted a little bit recently. More hotels are stirring to life as New York last week started the first phase of its reopening after the lockdown that started in the middle of March. The Millennium Times Square reopened on June 1st, while the Hilton Midtown is scheduled to open July 22nd. New York's occupancy rate was 47.1% for the week that ended June 6. That's down from the 90% level for the same period in 2019, but it's up from the low of 19.6% in the week that ended April 4th. So last week, 47.1% for the occupancy rate compared to 19.6% in the week that ended April 4th, but overall down from 90% same time last year. It's expected that the full recovery could take years because the city is so dependent on international travelers and tourists drawn to New York's attractions. Some theater industry officials are saying that Broadway might remain dark until next year, while business and group travel are expected to be slower to recover. When I mentioned earlier that the New York hotel industry was already at a disadvantage before the coronavirus lockdown because of the glut and the new development of hotels. Financial problems have been building in the New York hotel industry as supply has soared. The city added 15,000 rooms since 2015 and has 4,000 rooms in the pipeline for this year and 6,000 next year. And this is according to SunTrust Robinson Humphrey. Some New York hotel owners took on too much debt. And, of course, it's been a really challenging time to try to repay that during this lockdown. Another indicator about where we are with hotel rooms in New York is the revenue and revenue per available room, which is a metric used in the hotel industry. It was down $57.77 for the week ending June 6. And that's compared to $210.59 this for the same time period last year. So pretty dramatic difference there. And again, at a time when they need to start paying on these loans for building new hotel rooms. Many hotels that continue operating are facing financial pressure. The Hilton Times Square is expected to suffer a loss between $6 million and $8 million this year. We did talk about that just recently. And they might require the appointment of a receiver, according to its owner, which is Sunstone Hotel Investors, Inc. But that is a situation we'll have to continue to monitor. I'm just wondering why there was so much development of so many more rooms in the pipeline and continuing to be in the pipeline for this year and next year. It seems counterintuitive, but there's probably a lot more to this story that isn't written, and I don't know. So we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the payroll protection program and who benefited and who didn't and what that looks like right now.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
I feel like that ever since I started doing these podcasts, I've been talking about the payroll protection program. I did start doing these podcasts back in early March, and so I guess it was only a few weeks later that this program was introduced. And since that time, the program had given out more than $650 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses to help them through the pandemic and to try to keep people working and keep them off unemployment if possible. Almost immediately from the time that these programs were announced, because there were two different ones that were announced, and they were quite extraordinary in the fact that they did get passed by Congress, that they were bipartisan, and that also the president supported them as well. So that in itself was a major coup, that there was this concerted effort that all were unified on, and everyone believed for this to be a good thing. And it is. It is absolutely a good thing, and it's probably helped keep a lot of businesses still afloat during this time. However, what we have been seeing in the weeks following the program being instituted, that it just hasn't really worked for everyone, and maybe even for those who it was most intended for, the very small businesses, the mom and pop organizations, those who may be at a disadvantage to apply for a loan. And the recent article that I saw talks about some of the downfalls of the program. And it's kind of a shame to have to point those things out, because the intent of it was really good. And again, it has affected some positive outcomes for many businesses. And it's going to be a while before we know who they are, and that we're able to say it's because of those loans. You know, we're still right in the thick of this, and you know, companies, small businesses are right on the brink of whether they are going to be reopened. You know, many having had to close even before they reopen, like shutting down the business for good, because they can't meet the requirements of social distancing. For instance, like in a restaurant where they need to have tables 6 feet apart, and observe other practices that they may just not be set up to do, and or it might not be profitable for them to do that and keep them afloat. So unfortunately, you know, as I said, it hasn't worked for a lot of businesses, but with so many in this country, you know, was it ever going to be possible it would help everyone? But this recent article had said that, pointed out that the PPP left many of the hardest hit empty-handed. Looking back, the program failed to take into account the near countless varieties of small business, which employs nearly half of U.S. private sector workers, and how best to help them. was also not something that some feel was considered real well. It said that the program largely failed those that either closed during prolonged lockdowns, drew too few customers to afford more than a skeleton staff, or were overwhelmed by high overhead costs such as rent. Some businesses were too small to have relationships with banks, which processed the loans, leaving small entrepreneurs like sole proprietors, mom and pop shops, and others left them, on the sidelines because they didn't have relationships with banks. Other businesses were so small they didn't have the record keeping to be able to, put that in a loan application, the kinds of information that was needed. Some have said that one of the mistakes was that they wanted it to be a grant program, but they called it a loan program. And so there was some murkiness in how that would be administered and how it would be paid back. And that has since changed some of the rules around that. In fact, I reported on that in a recent podcast, that there was a new act that was approved or signed by Congress and the president that gave some additional flexibility on the loans. For instance, under the original language, they were to use the money within 8 weeks. Well, the problem there is that the pandemic has lasted longer than I think a lot of people expected. And so there are companies that are still waiting to reopen till their states would allow them to reopen. And the 8 weeks has come and gone. So the new provisions in the act that was passed, I believe was 2 weeks ago, said that they would have now 24 weeks to use the money. The other big sticking point that was changed was the original requirement was that the money be used, that 75% of the money be used toward payroll to actually keep employees paid. And that was proving difficult for many small businesses who took the loan, who needed it to pay the rent, just to still be there and have a presence and be ready for when and if they were going to be able to reopen. And so one of the changes that was made was to reduce that requirement to 60% toward payroll rather than the 75%. So clearly, some obstacles in the language of the program earlier. But, as some would defend, like Steve Mnuchin would say, the importance was to get it out there quickly, to try to help people right away, and that it wasn't going to be perfect and address every nuance and be able to help everyone. And, so I guess there's different thoughts about the, whether that was an effective approach. But, I guess the point is, too, that no one knew how long this was going to last. And, they wanted to act quickly. Congress and the government wanted to act quickly, but, didn't know how to pace itself with this money and with how it was going to administer the program, because we just didn't expect it to go on this long. And I keep saying, and I've heard others say, that we're waiting for someone to declare it's going to be over on this date and everything will be opened up, across the country. Well, the reality is that's not going to happen. Not even a governor really can say that, even if a governor says we're moving to this next phase or now you can do this. It's still pretty much widely required that you wear a mask wherever it is you go. When will that restriction change? Who knows? So It'll probably sort of whimper out after a while and hopefully not reemerge as a bigger monster later in the fall, as some are predicting. But there is no finish line. Well, despite however it is you feel about how the program was implemented, the fact is that the government did approve $4.6 million loans worth more than $513 billion as of June 16th. Unfortunately, those have reached a fraction of the 31.7 million small businesses in the U.S., a figure that also includes 25.7 million firms without employees. Still, we're talking about 4.6 million loans, and that seems a pretty good figure, though not enough. Well, that brings us to our last segment, which we'll get to in just a moment after this commercial. But something a little lighter, a little more positive, and that is how Spotify's doing. So we'll get to that in just a moment.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Okay, we're back. And as I said, something a little bit lighter to talk about. And that is what Spotify's been up to. Spotify, as you know, is a streaming service that enables music and podcasts to be streamed to subscribers. And I believe earlier during the lockdown, they may have offered some free listening or free memberships for a period of time. That's likely over. But that's not the point. The big news is that the company, their stock has really soared, at least as of June 18th, because of some really big decisions that they've made and a shift towards other content for their streaming service. So the big announcement at the beginning of the day on the 18th was that Kim Kardashian West had reached a deal with Spotify to do a podcast about her work with the Innocence Project. And this would be exploring topics that have come to the forefront of the national conversation in recent weeks. The show would be available exclusively on Spotify and will highlight the work of the nonprofit legal organization that she's affiliated with, which seeks to exonerate people who have been wrongly convicted. She had some success, as you may recall, recently, or actually I guess it was back in 2018 when she had met with President Trump and lobbied to have, I believe her name was Alice Marie Johnson, have her sentence reversed because she was incarcerated for 22 years in federal prison on a nonviolent drug conviction. So Kim Kardashian West had pleaded her case and she was exonerated. Her podcast, by the way, the Kardashian, Kim Kardashian podcast, is the latest in Spotify's efforts to really move toward non-musical content. The service recently struck a licensing deal worth more than $100 million with me to do a podcast. With Joe Rogan, host of the Joe Rogan Experience. So that made big news a few weeks back, that deal. And Spotify has been focused on podcasts for more than a year, spending over $600 million to snap up companies and content. So that was the story earlier in the day on June 18th. And then later in the day, it comes out that Spotify had signed a deal with Warner Brothers and DC Comics, or DC Entertainment, to produce and distribute an original slate of narrative scripted podcasts, which will be exclusively licensed to Spotify for a period of time. So this is pretty big news and should probably draw a whole lot more members, and just like the impact that it's had to its stock. The deal gives Spotify first look rights to original scripted narrative DC podcasts based on its stable of superheroes and supervillains. And that includes Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Harley Quinn, and the Joker. The shows will have new storylines that are set in the DC universe. And it's unrelated to the existing movies and TV shows that they have, like Wonder Woman 1984. In addition to the DC-based podcasts, Warner Brothers will develop original scripted podcast series based on other properties like Looney Tunes and Warner Brothers TV-produced shows like Supernatural. So, pretty big story there about where Spotify's heading, and it's just interesting the timing. I think the Kim Kardashian deal might have been signed or announced the day before, but came out in the news early on Thursday the 18th, and then, as I said, later on the announcement about the deal with DC and Warner Brothers. Being, probably less than 24 hours apart. So who knows what's going to happen tomorrow and what they might be looking at. But it's obvious that they have a strategy around this type of content and believe that it's going to be the wave of the future, and obviously positioning themselves well for that. So I'm going to keep my cell phone on even at night in case they try to reach me. I might be a little hard to get, but they can try, and we'll see what happens there. Well, I guess that's the end of today's podcast. I want to thank you for joining me for the GSMC Business News Podcast, although this last segment might not have sounded too businessy. But still, thanks for sharing it with me, and for listening to all of our podcasts on the GSMC Podcast Network. I want to invite you to please subscribe wherever it is that you subscribe to your podcasts, and also leave any comments or thoughts that you have on those podcast platforms, and then also on our social media sites, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Thanks again for joining me. I look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the GSMC Business News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's podcast.